For this project, we are going to be debating the topic of withholding artificial nutrition and hydration. We will be discussing whether or not it is ethical to withhold artificial nutrition and hydration from those in a persistent vegetative state. Group A is in support of withholding nutrition, and this is Group A.
I'm Andrew Tappana.
I'm Kaylen Knepp.
And I'm Brenn Hagarty.
And we are Group B, and we are in support of maintaining artificial nutrition and hydration.
I'm Shelby Dixon.
I'm Lauren Smith.
And I'm Megan Wasser. To begin, we are going to start with Group A.
Okay, so to begin, I would like to give a definition of what a persistent vegetative state is. So, according to the American Academy of Neurology, the definition of a persistent vegetative state is a form of eyes open, permanent unconsciousness in which a patient has periods of wakefulness and physiological sleep-wake cycles, but at no time is the patient aware of himself or his environment.
There was a study conducted by the American Neurological Association. Patients in the persistent vegetative state for more than 3 months after a non-traumatic injury have only a 1% probability of moderate disability or a good recovery. For patients still in a persistent vegetative state after 6 months, the probability was almost 0%. I don't know about you, but if I had no chance of survival, I wouldn't want my family, friends, and loved ones to suffer.
We believe that a patient in a persistent vegetative state with a 0% chance of recovery should be withheld of artificial nutrition and hydration. Due to the lack of brain activity, these patients are permanently unconscious and do not have the ability to swallow properly, respond to stimuli, or communicate. Since they are unable to swallow without a high risk of aspiration, artificial nutrition and hydration is used to sustain life. However, we believe these patients have such a low quality of life that it is unethical to continue treatment to preserve such a lifestyle.
Claiming an individual's quality of life is not deemed worthy should not be a decision made by an outside party. In fact, many survivors of disabling diseases would argue their quality of life could not have been determined until after their diagnosis. In other words, no one has the ability to fully understand what their life will be like with these conditions without knowing beforehand exactly what they will be suffering and how their life will end up.
Megan presents an excellent point. To add to this, David Jane, a disabled man suffering from ALS, explains this very point by saying, quote, "It is extremely easy for a healthy individual to say how they would not want to live. I am guilty myself. If someone had told me prior to the diagnosis that I would be totally paralyzed, fed by a feeding tube, communicate via computer with a voice synthesizer, and tethered to a ventilator, that I would find more meaning in life and living, I am certain I would have thought that person telling me such a tale was insane." End quote.
Can you sum up what he's trying to say for me, please?
I think that David Jane makes a excellent point that he would not want to have people telling him how he should live. That if he wants to live in that state and wants to get nutrition, then he should be fully independent in making those decisions and be able to do that.
Also, he is really trying to show that before you suffer this injury, before you go through this process and you are diagnosed with persistent vegetative state or just any disabling disability, you don't exactly know how you're going to feel about the situation. You don't know how debilitating the disease is. You don't know if you are going to be okay with it or not. Most people would say they don't want it. They wouldn't want life support, but
You don't know how much care you're going to want or how much care you're not going to want, basically.
Mm-hmm. Because I could break my leg or break all the bones in my body, not want to deal with that pain, and say that if I was in such a miserable state and I was suffering so much that I wouldn't want to continue living. But if I had the chance or the probability of living, or I knew that I could still recognize my family members, even though they may not know that I recognize them, but I feel like I can, I still may want to live in that state. So it's solely up to that person.
So what you're saying is if I broke my arm, and I would say I would not be able to handle life with a broken arm, and then once I have broken my arm, I'm like, just kidding, it's not that bad. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, basically.
Okay.
A little bit more extreme situations, not just a broken arm, but yes.
For example. Okay.
Yes.
I understand this example that Lauren explained is not a person in a persistent vegetative state, but he makes an important point. As healthy people, we don't understand what life as an ill and disabled individual is like, as you guys were just discussing. So who are we to judge about their quality of life?
Well, Shelby, if we're going to talk about the quality of life, then let's talk about the case of Terry Schiavo. In February of 1990, Schiavo collapsed at her home in full cardiac arrest. As a result, oxygen was deprived from her brain, causing a massive brain damage. After 3 months in a coma, Schiavo was declared to be in a persistent vegetative state. Artificial nutrition and hydration were being used until the Supreme Court allowed her husband to discontinue her feeding tube in March of 2005. 15 years later. 15 years of grieving for her husband. 15 years before his life was able to move forward. Terry Schiavo died 13 days after the removal of her feeding tube, proving that that was the only thing keeping her alive.
See, what I find interesting is that you say that her husband was having 15 years of grieving when he actually had started a family, had kids of his own during this whole period when she was in this vegetative state, when the only people that were actually showing the most grieving and fighting for her were her immediate family, her parents. They were so concerned that they were fighting not to have the feeding tube taken out. So that's why I find it hard that he was the one that had to be able to make this decision, because he goes on and finds a new wife. So therefore, why does it make it his decision any longer to have her care in his hands when he has a whole new family that he's worried about? Her parents wanted her there, and they experienced times with her, and they were the ones seeing her progress and or her decline. So they were the ones able to, like, accurately make a decision if they should have withheld or continued feeding. So I find it hard to believe that he was grieving for 15 years when he was not the sole person that was with her at all times.
I understand he wasn't the sole person with her, but people show their grieving in many different ways. For him, I only speculate, but I would imagine that he had to find some emotional outlet for his grieving, and that's probably why he, started up his new family. But that doesn't mean that he isn't still grieving at that time.
And to build off Andrew's point, as we've already said, patients in a persistent vegetative state for longer than 6 months have almost a 0% chance of recovery. So that means no patient after 15 years has any chance of recovery. That means Terry Schiavo was in this persistent vegetative state knowing that she wasn't going to progress. So that means for 15 years, she existed in an unconscious, non-responsive state. In the case of David Jane, which Lauren brought up, he was able to have conversation and enjoy moments with those who were surrounding him. His outlook on the quality of life with a severe disability is inspiring. However, I fail to agree that his quality of life can be comparable to the quality of Schiavo's. She was unable to share her simplest thoughts, let alone communication. So I know if it were me laying in bed in a persistent vegetative state for 15 years, unable to communicate with my family, unable to express my wishes, unable to move forward with any parts of my life, unlike David Jane, I don't think that is a life we should be giving to anyone.
While she may have seemed non-responsive in medical terms, if you were her family, we watched multiple videos where she interacted with her father, and he shared stories with her where she would laugh and she would moan and groan in response to things he said to her, to stories he shared, and they would laugh together. So they still had these personal moments together where they were able to bond and get to know, like, grow and get to know each other. Also, they tested Terry Schiavo's swallowing abilities. While she may not have been able to swallow completely, she still had the ability to recognize food in her mouth. So we believe that if she had these periods where she could recognize food, she could laugh with her father when he makes jokes, that she still retained some periods of responsiveness. Even though they may have been really small periods, they were really significant to her family and to people around her. If she can attempt to swallow in the presence of food and laugh at what seems appropriate, then this appears to be going against the definition of a persistent vegetative state where she is not aware at all of herself or her environment. We also found articles where there were doctors who disagreed. The parents were able to find doctors who fought against it, saying that they didn't think she was in a persistent vegetative state, that she did react to some stimuli, and that she was able to respond. And that tiny bit of hope is something I feel her parents have the right to hang on to. And they wanted to keep her alive. They wanted to deal with her, and they wanted to take over her care, even though her husband was no longer wanting to do that. Also, we believe that this gray line that is present for diagnosing a patient, whether they're in this state or not, is extremely controversial. So, like, how can you validate ending someone's life-sustaining treatment, such as artificial nutrition, to any person who is questionably aware or conscious?
To address your point about Terry Schiavo's effort to swallow in the presence of food, that is consistent with the diagnosis of a persistent vegetative state. If you recall, a patient in a persistent vegetative state may, in fact, attempt to swallow. However, they remain in extremely high risk for aspiration, which in itself is terrifying for a patient, terrifying for family members or the people that are caring for her, along with the fact that it could actually take her life itself. This risk is why the artificial nutrition and hydration is implemented, because they're not able to swallow themselves. So having the feeding tube is extremely important.
To add to Kaylen's point, according to the National Center for Ethics in Healthcare, patients in a persistent vegetative state can make vocalizations and vary their facial expression, but that doesn't mean that their actions are purposeful. To someone who is not familiar with the condition, however, the patients in this state appear to be making deliberate gestures, or to be at least minimally aware. From an outsider's perspective, it appears these patients are self-aware and self-sustaining. But ultimately, artificial nutrition and hydration are the only things maintaining their life.
So, like Andrew said, these patients can make vocalizations, they can have facial expressions, and those very much could explain what you saw in those videos. It doesn't necessarily say that she is now self-aware. And like Andrew brought up, the only thing that was prolonging her life was artificial nutrition and hydration, which is very similar to the case of Nancy Cruzan when continuing life in this state was not what she claimed to have wanted. Cruzan was a 25-year-old who was found to be in a persistent vegetative state after a car accident in 1984. She was denied the right to end her artificial nutrition treatments by the Missouri Supreme Court. Cruzan vocalized to a friend that she would not like to be kept alive as what she calls a vegetable. She did not want a life of unconsciousness and lack of self-awareness. And by continuing treatment with artificial nutrition and hydration, it would have continued her vegetative state and ultimately gone against what she said she wanted. Many people say they don't want life-sustaining measures to keep them in this state, such as Nancy Cruzan, but what the lay person doesn't realize is that artificial nutrition and hydration is not considered as life support. So when people vocalize to others that they don't want to be a vegetable, they don't want to be kept on life support, artificial nutrition and hydration is not categorized the same. So often these types of patients who state they don't want to be on life support have prolonged lives with artificial nutrition and hydration, and we believe that that goes against their wishes. In this kind of situation, we believe that a feeding tube is an added measure, and it's unethical to give when a patient has requested not to have life-supporting treatments if in a vegetative state.
What you failed to mention was the Missouri Supreme Court ruled that there was no clear evidence that Cruzan clearly and convincingly stated she would want nutrition and hydration withdrawn. In fact, the hospital employees associated with Cruzan's care felt uncomfortable discontinuing her feeding. Ethically, it is very difficult to base such a permanent life-ending decision on a statement shared between friends years ago. If I were to tell you right now that I would want you to pull the plug if anything like that happened to me and I was unable to care for myself and in a vegetative state, that doesn't mean 5 years, 10 years from now, I would still have that same opinion. So that's not right to go off what they shared so long ago on something that is so serious and is actually a reality now. Also, as Andrew said before, that for you to say that her actions of the moaning and groaning were not purposeful, this is in the Terry Schiavo case, there also is no proof saying that those weren't purposeful actions, so for you to say that they may not have been purposeful actions, that's just an assumption. But those could have been purposeful actions, and she could have actually been responsive and had, been able to interact with her family members.
Shelby makes a very, very excellent point. And to add to that, we would dispute your comment about artificial nutrition being a part of life support. According to many disability rights activists, patients in a persistent vegetative state are not terminally ill. I repeat, are not terminally ill. They are suffering from a severe brain disability and still have functional organs. A feeding tube is enough for these patients to sustain a life for years, proving that their bodies are still functional. As opposed to a ventilator that performs the action of breathing for a patient who without could not breathe on their own, a feeding tube is more of a comfort measure than a corrective measure. These patients still have functional GI tracts and the ability to perform all its necessary functions to sustain life. Only their capacity to swallow is impaired. Would you deprive someone with esophageal cancer who has lost the ability to swallow a feeding tube because they stated they would never want life support? I sure would not. Is the purpose of a feeding tube to provide nutrients to the disabled patients not the same?
While that is a convincing point, these patients are experiencing very different qualities of life. A patient with esophageal cancer, though they are debilitated, have the ability to interact purposely, respond to the environment, and communicate with their loved ones and family. As mentioned before, a patient in a persistent vegetative state will always be just that, a person in a vegetative state. Extending life on tube feeding treatments would not only prolong a lower quality of life, but it will cost families or care providers in the community a noteworthy amount of money. You have to remember patients in a persistent vegetative state are at higher risk for bed sores, infections, malnutrition, and etc. without the excellent care provided. The cost of the required care that must be provided is a large weight for families and the community to bear. Although it seems harsh, the reality of it has to be addressed. Therefore, an accumulation of all these hospital bills is just going to continue to add up and burden the family for years to come. Like in Schiavo's case, in addition to the 15 years, the hospital bills, I'm sure, continue to haunt her husband every month that they came in. I know if I had a family member that was ill and in the hospital for 15 to 20 years and not actually living or responding to my touch or my communication, I would be extremely just upset and grieving every moment I got something that reminded me of them, like a bill and things of that sort. And it would continue to just add up and be an emotional toll that really would never go away.
Kaylen, I understand that you say this is an emotional toll for you, having to see them in this state for years, days, months at a time. But wouldn't it be more of an emotional burden to end a person's life or your loved one's life? You may have the reminder once a month with that bill, but you will have to wake up every day with the reminder you ended your loved one's life. Personally, I don't think I could ever fully come to terms with that decision.
I understand with what you're saying. I guess more so the point I'm trying to make is that we're changing the life of an entire family. Not only is the person who's laying in the bed in the persistent vegetative state being affected, but they're affecting their wife, their husband, or all of their children that are home and extended family as well. I feel like it's even the simple things like being able to be at home with their children and helping them with their homework or reading them a book to go to bed, and those things that are part of the normal life that they cherish and love. They don't get to have those when they're spending, I would assume, most of their time at the hospital. And on top of that, they're, I'm sure, having to get people to take care of the children and whatnot. And I feel like it just could really put a damper on all of the relationships in the family, plus placing a very heavy burden on all of them, along with the financial toll that we were talking about. And I feel that on top of that, the children probably would never really understand what was going on. And so if we're just continuing to prolong and telling them that they have family in the hospital and it's been 15 years, I think they would never quite understand, and it would be an emotional toll that really would not go away.
Well, Kaylen, I'm really glad you brought up that point. Personally, I have a wife and children and a child at home. I couldn't imagine continuing artificial nutrition and hydration for myself if I were the patient, and there was no chance of me recovering to anything resembling a good quality of life. That would be the last thing I could wish upon my family, to have my wife have to visit me in the hospital every day, my child who isn't even a year old yet, and 5, 10, 15 years from now still coming to visit me in the hospital when he doesn't even know me. I just couldn't imagine that, and I couldn't wish that upon them.
We agree that the financial strain you're talking about would be significant, but willing to end someone's life based on the issue of money seems completely unethical. To validate someone's life based on how much money they cost, so giving their life a price tag, is completely wrong. Care providers who are going to base their decisions off of money could be choosing to end someone's life for the wrong reason. They could be ending it just because the person is too expensive or they can't afford it, which would be really hard to do, but is that enough of a reason for you to end someone's life? Like Shivo's husband, for example, he already had a wife and kids, and her parents were willing to take care of her, were willing to do all these things, so it's sort of suspicious that he was fighting so hard for her tube to be pulled after, it was 11 or 13 years where he had watched this happen, where he had found a new family, but her parents were still holding on to the hope, and they still cherish those small memories they had with her. So it's just slightly suspicious. So you never know what someone in these cases why they're choosing to end someone's life, and especially in cases where patients have not previously made their wishes for their end of life care known. Assigning a surrogate or someone to decide whether or not they should continue to live is an extremely easy situation for someone to take advantage of a patient in that state. They would be, even if the surrogate knows the patient's wishes, they're prior to the diagnosis, prior to them suffering this illness, such as Cruzanne's friend stating that they knew what she wanted, it is nearly impossible to say that the patient's wishes have not changed, like Shelby said. In 5 or 10 years, you don't know if that's still what you're going to want. You don't know even the moment you said it right then and then it happened to you that afterwards you would still want that. You have no idea once you're in that state what you would want or what you could handle. So,
as we mentioned earlier, those suffering from a severe, debilitating disability fail to understand the harshness of their decision made prior to diagnosis. Once again, it is easy for an individual to say they would not want to continue life in a persistent vegetative state, but how can we predict that individuals in this condition would want to end their lives? By removing their feeding treatment and nutrition and hydration, this is ultimately deciding their fate for them. Who are we to play God? We always tell the patients that they have the power to choose their care, but yet when something so serious happens, the patient's decisions are no longer theirs, and they're taken out of their hands, and we decide that their life is worth ending, and I just don't find that ethical at all.
Well, Shelby, nobody said anything about playing God. We want to do what's in the best interest for both the patient and the family, and we believe that this will provide less suffering for both. Now, Megan, to address your argument that surrogates with little knowledge of the patient's wishes prior to the persistent vegetative state are not able to justify withholding artificial nutrition, we would have to disagree. Although families may feel tremendous guilt, they should know that according to the National Center for Ethics in Healthcare, by definition, patients in a persistent vegetative state do not have the capacity to suffer because they lack self-awareness. Moreover, research has shown that even self-aware hospice patients who voluntarily refuse nutrition and hydration do not experience bad or painful death.
Right. So, and I think what Andrew just said is really important, that even people who are self-aware, even people who are conscious and ability to make the decision for themselves in that current moment do not suffer or have pain when they are being withheld from artificial nutrition and hydration. So I think that's really important for us to understand that as hard as it is to be an emotional thing to withhold the artificial nutrition, I think it's a common misconception that it causes pain, that we're causing people to suffer. We're not arguing that we want people to have a hard end of life, to have a painful death. We're saying we want them to have a death that is respectable. And
But who's to say that it's their time to die? That's what we're saying. We're saying that, yes, we know that it might not be harmful, and that when they do withhold it, they might not suffer from it. But taking it away in general is what we find is wrong, because that is what they need at that point.
And I understand that you feel that it's wrong, but in 2005, the Washington Post did a poll, and the participants were specifically asked what they would want to be done if they were in a persistent vegetative state, and only 8% of the people reported that they would prefer to be kept alive with artificial nutrition and hydration, whereas 87% said that they would not, which means the majority of the people said they would not like to have their life sustained on artificial nutrition and hydration, meaning if we're going to do what we feel that someone would want, it is clear to me that the majority would not want to sustain their life that way. So when we say we're going to keep them living, we're going to sustain their life this way, we have arguably committed a violation of autonomy by using extra means to treat this patient. So I understand that it's a hard thing to do, and it seems wrong, but I have a hard time believing that it's unethical when I feel like the majority of the people would actually want you to do that. And we're saying we don't want them to continue a life that won't benefit them in the future.
Well, in response to that, I'd like to point out that this survey was done in 2005. It is now 2013. So I'd just like to prove the point about how Nancy Cruzen's friend, they talked about that, but 5-10 years later, that could have changed. So it is now 2013. That's at least 5-10 years later. So if we went back and surveyed those people, and maybe they've been through some experiences like that with their family members, they might not have the same response, and this might not be 80 to 87%. So that, to me, is a very, that's a good fact, but it is 2013 now, so I would like to see that survey done again.
I think that survey kind of like has that flaws, and we could do it again. It'd be interesting to actually interview the exact same people again. But I think still it's an extremely good point to make and something to focus on for the fact that the majority of people would want that. But I think there is a flaw in that, and it would be very interesting and time-worthy to do that again.
I also think, though, that you would have to take into consideration that the person sitting in the bed when you're making that decision could be part of that 8%. You don't know if that person is part of the 8% or part of the 87% because they can't tell you whether they are or not. So saying that you would withhold it because the majority wants that doesn't necessarily mean it's right for that person.
At the same time, I have a harder time arguing that we should hold it because there's that 8%. Like, you're going against what 87 is a big number. You're going against what a huge majority would actually prefer you to do. Therefore, I think you're taking away their right to choose.
Yeah, the autonomy that we were talking about and whatnot. So I totally agree with you. When the majority would want to withhold artificial nutrition and hydration, we feel that it is safe to assume withholding treatment is the best interest of the patient. Patients in a persistent vegetative state after 6 months have almost 0% chance of recovery and have a very extremely low quality of life. In the Nancy Cruzan case, the Supreme Court ruled that when Cruzan stated she did not want to be a vegetable, it was appropriate to withhold artificial tube feedings, providing that many lay or an average person would assume that artificial nutrition and hydration are part of life support, and we agree. Sustaining life for these individuals is not only costly, but it's unethical. Artificial nutrition and hydration should be withheld for a patient in a persistent vegetative state out of dignity and respect for their life and their family's lives.
While we acknowledge your point of view, overall, we believe that ending an individual's life by removing their artificial nutrition and hydration is extremely, extremely unethical. Without express knowledge of what the individual would want in that current state, or simply assuming what they would want, it is impossible for one to justify ending another's life. Appointing a surrogate to make someone else's end-of-life decisions results in a high risk of terminating a life for the very wrong reasons. In conclusion, ending someone's life based on the perceived quality, costs, and numerous gray lines involved makes it unethical to withhold artificial nutrition and hydration from a patient in a persistent vegetative state. Thank you for watching, and
Happy holidays!